Can someone explain the password authentication in the /etc/ssh/sshd_config file? On this page, the explanation given is: the option password authentication specifies whether we should use password-based authentication. For strong security, this option must always be set to yes. But it fails to provide any use case scenarios that clarifies when a yes or no would be appropriate. Can someone please elaborate further?
Your link points to documentation 10 years out of date. SSH support multiple ways to authenticate users. The most common one is by asking a login and a password, but you can also authenticate user a login and a public key. If you set password authentication to no, you will no longer be able to use a login and password to authenticate and must use a login and public key instead, if PUP authentication is set to yes.
Please note that the password authentication setting does not control all password-based authentication. Challenge response authentication usually also asks for passwords. Password authentication controls support for the password authentication scheme defined in RFC 4252, Section 8. Challenge response authentication controls support for the keyboard interactive authentication scheme defined in RFC 4256. The keyboard interactive authentication scheme could, in theory, ask a user any number of multifaceted questions. In practice, it often asks only for the user's password. If you want to fully disable password-based authentication, set both password authentication and challenge response authentication to no. If you're of the belt and suspenders mindset, consider setting uspam to no as well. Public/private key-based authentication, enabled by the PUP authentication setting, is a separate type of authentication that does not involve sending user passwords to the server, of course. Some would argue that using challenge response authentication is more secure than password authentication because it is more difficult to automate. They therefore recommend leaving password authentication disabled while leaving challenge response authentication enabled. This configuration also encourages, but does not necessarily prevent, use of public key authentication for any automated system logins. But, since SSH is a network-based protocol, the server has no way to guarantee that responses to challenge response authentication, aka keyboard interactive, are actually being provided by a user sitting at a keyboard so long as the challenge is always and only consists of asking a user for her password.
Password authentication is the easiest implementation, as there is nothing to do. The counterpart is that you send your password, over an encrypted connection, to the server. This can be a security problem if the server has been compromised, as the password could then be captured. With public key, your password is not transmitted to the server, it's more secure but it needs more setup.
You can set it to no when using keys, or to force their use.
Review 2 på handel. Läsekonstigt subscribing.